Lessons 13 and 14 of the History of London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. The History of London by Walter Besant. Lesson 13. Fitzstephen's Account of the City. Part 1. The White Tower is the only building in modern London which belongs to Norman London. Portions remain, fragments, a part of the church of St. Bartholomew the Great, a part of the church of St. Ethelburga, the crypt of Bow Church, very little else. All the rest has been destroyed by time, by improvements, or by fire, the greatest enemy to cities in every country and every age. Thus 3 great fires in the 10th and 11th century swept London from end to end. No need to ask if anything remains of the Roman or the Saxon city. Not a vestige is left, except the little fragment known as the London Stone, now lying behind iron bars in the wall of St. Swithin's Church. Churches, palaces, monasteries, castles, all perished in those 3 fires. The city, no doubt, speedily sprang again from its ashes, but of its rebuilding on each occasion we have no details at all. Most fortunately, there exists a document priceless and unique, short as it is, and meagre in many of its details, which describes London as it was in the reign of Henry II. It is written by one Fitzstephen, chaplain to Thomas Becket. He was present at the murder of the Archbishop, and wrote his life, to which this account is an introduction. He says, first of all, that the city contained 13 larger conventual churches and 126 parish churches. He writes only 50 years after the Great Fire, so that it is not likely that new parishes had been erected. All the churches which had been destroyed were rebuilt. Most of them were very small parishes, with, doubtless, very small churches. We shall return presently to the question of the churches. On the east was the White Tower, which he calls the Palatine Castle. On the west there were 2 towers. There was the tower called Montfichet, where is now Blackfriars Station, and Baynard's Castle close beside it. The walls of the city had 7 double gates. The river wall had by this time been taken down. 2 miles from the city, on the west, was the Royal Palace, Westminster, fortified with ramparts and connected with the city by a populous suburb. Already, therefore, the Strand and Charing Cross were settled. The gates were Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Cripplegate, Aldersgate, Newgate, Ludgate, and the Bridge. Fitzstephen says that the citizens were so powerful that they could furnish the king with 20,000 horsemen and 60,000 foot. This is clearly gross exaggeration. If we allow 500 for each parish, we get a population of only 63,000 in all, and in the enumeration later on, for the poll tax by Richard II, there were no more than 48,000. This, however, was shortly after a great plague had ravaged the city. But the writer tells us that the citizens excelled those of any other city in the world in handsomeness of manners and of dress, at table, and in way of speaking. There were 3 principal schools, the scholars of which rivalled each other and engaged in public contests of rhetoric and grammar. Those who worked at trades and sold wares of any kind were assigned their proper place, whither they repaired every morning. It is easy to make out from the surviving names where the trades were placed. The names of Bread Street, Fish Street, Milk Street, Honey Lane, Wood Street, Soapers Lane, the Poultry, for instance, indicate what trades were carried on there. Friday Street shows that the food proper for fast days was sold there, namely dried fish. Cheapside preserves the name of the Cheap, the most important of all the old streets. Here, every day, all the year round, was a market held, at which everything conceivable was sold, not in shops, but in selds, that is, covered wooden sheds, which could be taken down on occasion. Do not think that Cheap was a narrow street: it was a great open space lying between St. Paul's and what is now the Royal Exchange, with streets north and south formed by rows of these selds or sheds. Presently the sheds became houses with shops in front and gardens behind. The roadway on the south side of this open space was called the Side of Cheap. There was another open space for salesmen called East Cheap, another at Billingsgate called Room Lane, another at Dowgate, both for purposes of exposing for sale imports landed on the quays and the ports of Queenhithe and Billingsgate. Those who have seen a market-place in a French town will understand what these places were like. A large irregular area, on every side sheds with wares for sale. At first all seems confusion and noise. Presently one makes out that there are streets in orderly array, in which those who know can find what they want. Here are mercers, here goldsmiths, here armourers, here glovers, here pepperers or grocers, and so forth. Westcheap is the place of shops where they sell the things made in the city and all things wanted for the daily life. On the other side of the Walbrook, across which there is a bridge where is now the Poultry, is Eastcheap, whither they bring all kinds of imported goods and sell them to the retailers. And by the riverside the merchants assemble in the open places beside Queenhithe and Billingsgate to receive or to buy the cargoes sent over from France, Spain, and the Low Countries. One more open space there was, that round St. Paul's, the place where the people held their folk motes. But London was not as yet by any means built over. Its northern parts were covered with gardens. It was here, as we shall see, that the great monasteries were shortly to be built. End of Lesson 13. Lesson 14. Fitzstephen's account of the City, Part 2. Outside the walls, he says, there were many places of pleasant resort, streams and springs among them. He means the Fleet River winding at the bottom of its broad valley, farther west Tyburn and Westbourne, on the south the Wandle, the Effra, the Ravensbourne. There was a well at Holywell in the Strand, it lies under the site of the present Opéra Comique Theatre, and at Clerkenwell. These wells had medicinal or miraculous properties, and there were, no doubt, taverns and places of amusement about there. At Smithfield, or Smoothfield, just outside the city walls, there was held once a week, on Friday, a horse fair. Business over, horse racing followed. Then the river was full of fish. Some went fishing for their livelihood, some for amusement. Salmon were plentiful, and great fish such as porpoises sometimes found their way above bridge. Then there were the sports of the young men and the boys. They played at ball. When have not young men played at ball? The young Londoners practised some form of hockey, out of which have grown the two noble games of cricket and golf. They wrestled and leapt. Nothing is said about boxing and quarterstaff, but perhaps these belonged to the practice of arms and archery, which were never neglected, because at any moment the London craftsman might have to become a soldier. They had cock-fighting, a sport to which the Londoner was always greatly addicted. And they loved dancing with the girls to the music of pipe and tabor. In the winter, when the broad fens north of the walls were frozen, they skated, and they hunted with hawk and hound in the Forest of Middlesex, which belonged to the City. The City, he tells us, is governed by the same laws as those of Rome. Like Rome, London is divided into wards. Like Rome, the City has annually elected magistrates, who are called sheriffs instead of consuls. Like Rome, it has senatorial and inferior magistrates. Like Rome, it has separate courts and proper places for lawsuits, and like Rome, the City holds assemblies on ordered days. The writer is carried away by his enthusiasm for Rome. As we have seen, the government, laws, and customs of London owed nothing at all in any single respect to Rome. Everything grew out of the Anglo-Saxon laws and customs. By his loud praise of the great plenty of food of every kind which could be found in London, FitzStephen reminds us that he has lived in other towns, and especially in Canterbury, when he was in the service of the Archbishop. We see, though he does not mention it, the comparison in his mind between the plentiful market of London and the meagre market of Canterbury. Everything, he says, was on sale. All the roasted meats and boiled that one can ask for, all the fish, poultry, and game in season could every day be bought in London. There were cook shops where dinners and suppers could be had by paying for them. He dwells at length upon this abundance. Now, in the country towns and the villages, the supplies were a matter of uncertainty and anxiety. A housewife had to keep her pantry and her larder well victualled in advance. Salt meat and salt fish were the staple of food. Beef and mutton were scarce. Game there was in plenty, if it could be taken, but game laws were strict. Very little venison would find its way into Canterbury market. To this cleric, who knew the country markets, the profusion of everything in London was amazing. Another thing he notices, quote, "Nearly all the bishops, abbots, and magnates of England are, as it were, citizens and freemen of London, having their own splendid houses to which they resort, where they spend largely when summoned to great councils by the King, or by their metropolitan, or drawn thither by their own private affairs." End quote. In another century or two London will become, as you shall see, a city of palaces. Observe that the palaces are already beginning. Observe also that London is already being enriched by the visits and residence of great lords, who, with their retinues, spend "largely." Down to the present day the same thing has always gone on. The wealthy people who have their town houses in the West End of London, and the thousands of country people and foreigners who now flock to the London hotels, are the successors of the great men and their following who came up to London in the 12th century and spent largely. "I do not think," says FitzStephen, "that there is any city with more commendable customs of church attendance, honour to God's ordinances, keeping sacred festivals, almsgiving, hospitality, confirming, betrothals, contracting marriages, celebration of nuptials, preparing feasts, cheering the guests, and also in care for funerals and the interment of the dead. The only pests of London are the immoderate drinking of fools and the frequency of fires." End of Lesson 14. Recording by Ruth Golding. 15 to 18 of the History of London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. The History of London by Walter Besant. Lesson 15. London Bridge, Part 1. Nobody knows who built the first bridge. It was there in the 4th century, a bridge of timber provided with a fortified gate, one of the gates of the city. Who put it up and when, how long it stood, what space there was between the piers, how broad it was, we do not know. Probably it was quite a narrow bridge, consisting of beams laid across side by side, and a railing at the side. That these beams were not close together is known by the fact that so many coins have been found in the bed of the river beneath the old bridge. Besides the bridge there were ferries across the river, especially between Dowgate and the opposite bank called St. Mary Overy's Dock, where was afterwards erected St. Mary Overy's Priory, to which belonged the church now called St. Saviour's, Southwark. The docks at either end of the old ferry still remain. The bridge had many misfortunes. It is said to have been destroyed by the Danes in 1013. Perhaps for destruction we should read damage. It was, however, certainly burned down in the Great Fire of 1136. Another, also of wood, was built in its place, and, in the year 1176, a bridge of stone was commenced, which took 30 years to build and remained standing till the year 1831, when the present bridge was completed and the old one pulled down. The architect of this stone bridge, destined to stand for 650 years, was one Peter, chaplain of St. Mary Colechurch in the Old Jewry. The church was destroyed in the Great Fire and not rebuilt. Now, the building of bridges was regarded at this time as a work of piety. If we consider how a bridge helps the people, we shall agree with our forefathers. Without a bridge, those living on one side of a river can only carry on intercourse with those on the other side by means of boats. Merchants cannot carry their wares about. Farmers cannot get their produce to market. Wayfarers can only get across by ferry. Armies cannot march. If you wish to follow an army across a country where there are no bridges, you must look for fords. Roads are useless unless bridges cross the rivers. The first essential to the union of a nation is the possibility of intercommunication. Without roads and bridges, the man of Devon is a stranger and an enemy to the man of Somerset. We who have bridges over every river, who need never even ford a stream, who hardly know what a ferry means, easily forget that these bridges did not grow like the oaks and the elms, but were built after long study of the subject by men who were trained for the work, just as other men were trained and taught to build cathedrals and churches. A religious order was founded in France in the 12th century. It was called the Order of the Pontife Brethren. Pontife is pontifex, that is, bridge builder. The bridge-building brothers constructed many bridges in France, of which several still remain. It is not certain that Peter of Colechurch was one of this brotherhood, perhaps not. When he died in 1205, before the bridge was completed, King John called over a French pontife named Isambert, who had built bridges at La Rochelle and Saintes. But the principal builders are said to have been 3 merchants of London, named Serle Mercer, William Almain, and Benedict Boatwright. The building of the bridge was regarded as a national work. The King, the great lords, the bishops, as well as the London citizens, gave money to hasten its completion. The list of donors was preserved on "a table fair written for posterity," in the chapel on the bridge. It was unhappily destroyed in the Great Fire. It must not be supposed that the bridge of Peter Colechurch was like the present stately bridge, of broad arches. It contained 20 arches of irregular breadth, only 2 or 3 being the same. They varied from 10 feet to 32 feet. Some of them, therefore, were very narrow. The piers were also of different lengths. These irregularities were certainly intentional, and were based upon some observations on the rise and fall of the tide. No other great bridge had yet been constructed across a tidal river. When the bridge was built, it was thought necessary to consecrate it to some saint. The latest saint, St. Thomas Becket, was chosen as the titular saint of this bridge. A chapel, dedicated to him, was built in the centre pier of the bridge. It was, in fact, a double chapel. In the lower part, the crypt, was buried Peter of Colechurch himself. The upper part, which escaped the Great Fire, became, after the Reformation, a warehouse. End of Lesson 15. Lesson 16. London Bridge, Part 2. Houses were erected in course of time along the bridge on either side, like a street, but with intervals, and along the roadway in the middle were chain posts to protect the passengers. As the bridge was only 40 feet wide, the houses must have been small. But they were built out at the back, overhanging the river, and the roadway itself was not intended for carts or wheeled vehicles. Remember that everything was brought to the City on pack horse or pack ass. The table of tolls, sanctioned by King Edward I, makes no mention of cart or waggon at all. Men on horseback and loaded horses can get along with a very narrow road. Perhaps we may allow 12 feet for the road, which gives for the houses on either side a depth of 14 feet each. These houses were occupied chiefly by shops, most of which were "haberdashers and traders in small wares." Later on there were many booksellers. Paper merchants and stationers after the Reformation occupied the chapel. The great painter Hans Holbein lived on the bridge, and the two marine painters Peter Monamy and Dominic Serres also lived here. The narrowness of the arches and the rush of the flowing or the ebbing tide made the shooting of the bridge a matter of great danger. The Duke of Norfolk in 1429 was thrown into the water by the capsizing of his boat, and narrowly escaped with his life. Queen Henrietta in 1628 was nearly wrecked in the same way by running into the piers while shooting the bridge. Rubens the painter was thrown into the water in the same way. One of the 20 arches formed a drawbridge, which allowed vessels of larger size than barges to pass up the river, and could be used to keep back an enemy. In this way Sir Thomas Wyatt in 1557 was kept out of London. Before this drawbridge stood a tower, on the battlements of which were placed the heads of traitors and criminals. The heads of Sir William Wallace, Jack Cade, Sir Thomas More, and many others were stuck up here. On the Southwark side was another tower. The bridge, which was the pride and boast of London, was endowed with lands for its maintenance. The rents of the houses were also collected for the same purpose. A toll was imposed on all merchandise carried across, and a brotherhood was formed called the Brothers of St. Thomas on the Bridge, whose duty it was to perform service in the chapel and to keep the bridge in repair. Repairs were always wanting. To keep some of the force of the water off the piers, these were furnished with starlings, i.e. at first piles driven down in front of the piers, afterwards turned into projecting buttresses of stone. Then corn mills were built in some of the openings, and in the year 1582 great waterworks were constructed at the southern end. The tower before the drawbridge was by Queen Elizabeth rebuilt and made a very splendid house, called Nonesuch House. The fire destroyed the houses on the bridge, some of which were not rebuilt, and in the year 1757 all the houses were removed from the bridge. The new bridge was finished and opened in 1831. It stands 180 feet west of its predecessor. Then the old bridge was pulled down. The work of Peter Colechurch lasted from 1209 to 1831, or 622 years. The Pontife brothers, therefore, knew how to put in good and lasting work. This is the history of London Bridge. First, a narrow wooden gangway of beams lying on timber piles with a fortified gate. Then a stone structure of 20 irregular arches, the bridge broad, but the roadway still narrow, with houses on either side, and a fortress and a chapel upon it. In those times there was always a fortress and there was always a chapel. It must have been a pleasant place of residence, the air fresh and clear, the supply of water unlimited, one drew it up in a bucket, always something going on, the entrance of a foreign ambassador, a religious procession, a riding of the Lord Mayor, a pageant, a nobleman with his livery, a bishop or a prior with his servants, a pilgrimage, a string of pack horses out of Kent bringing fruit for the city, always something to see. Then there were the stories and traditions of the place, with the songs which the children sang about the bridge. Especially there was the story of Edward Osborne. He was the son of one Richard Osborne, a gentleman of Kent. Like many sons of poor country gentlemen, he was sent up to London and apprenticed to Sir William Hewitt, a cloth worker who lived on London Bridge. His master had a daughter named Anne, a little girl who one day, while playing with her nurse at an open window overhanging the river, fell out into the rushing water 60 feet below. The apprentice, young Osborne, leapt into the river after her and succeeded in saving her. When the girl was grown up, her father gave her to his ex-apprentice, Edward Osborne, to wife. Edward Osborne became Lord Mayor. His descendant is now Duke of Leeds, so that the dukedom of Leeds sprang from that gallant leap out of the window overhanging the River Thames from London Bridge. End of Lesson 16. Lesson 17. The Tower of London, Part 1. In an age when every noble's house was a castle, and when every castle was erected in order to dominate, as well as to defend, the town and the district in which it stood, the Tower of London was erected. The builder of the White Tower was William the Conqueror, who gave the city its charter, but had no intention of giving up his own sovereignty. The architect, as has been already said, was one Gundulph, Bishop of Rochester. Part of the city wall was pulled down to make room for it, and it was intended at once for the King's Palace, the King's Castle, and the King's Prison. It was also the key of London. Who held the Tower held the city. William Rufus built a wall round the Tower so as to separate it entirely from the city, and to prevent the danger of a hasty rising of the people. With the same object he gave it a water gate. 100 years later, while Richard Coeur de Lion was on his crusade, the moat was constructed. Henry III. And his son Edward I. added to the outer walls and strengthened them. There is a plan of the Tower made from a survey of the year 1597 and published by the Society of Antiquaries. A study of the plan should be made before visiting the place. Remark first of all that the fortress has 3 entrances only, one at the south-west angle to the city, one to the river now called Traitor's Gate, and one on the south-east angle called the Iron Gate. That it is surrounded by a broad and deep moat which could be filled at every high tide. That from the moat rises a battlemented wall, and that within this first wall is another, flanked with protecting towers. That the city entrance is most jealously guarded by a strong gate first, then by a narrow way passing under a tower, then over a bridge. In all mediæval castles the first thought was to make it impossible to carry the place by a rush. If we would restore the Tower of Queen Elizabeth to the Tower of Edward III., we must abolish all those buildings which stand on the north and east sides, with those called lieutenants' lodgings on the south. The space on the north side of the keep was the exercising ground. Stables there must have been somewhere in this great area. The men-at-arms would live in the smaller towers. If you will study this plan carefully, you will understand the general arrangement of a mediæval castle. In the 16th century the place was no longer regarded as a fortress for the defence or the domination of the city. but the old forms were kept up. Nobody was admitted who carried arms: the guard kept the gate: a garrison was maintained. Within there was an armoury, the beginning of the splendid collection which is now shown. There was a mint for the coining of money. There were collections of tapestry, saddles, bed furniture, and robes belonging to the Crown. Here were kept the crown and sceptre and insignia. Here was the royal menagerie. Here were the rooms reserved for state criminals. It was no longer the royal palace, but the sovereign sometimes occupied the Tower. James I. was here, for instance, in 1604. Near the outer gate, where is now the refreshment room, were kept the King's lions. Henry I. began this menagerie, which was continued until the year 1834. At the entrance of the fortress is the Bell Tower, where Queen Elizabeth was once confined. The Water Gate, called Traitor's Gate, is under St. Thomas's Tower. The Beauchamp Tower has been the prison of, among others, Queen Anne Boleyn and Lady Jane Grey. In the Great White Tower Richard II. Abdicated in favour of Henry IV. In the vaults are dungeons, once the prison of Guy Fawkes. In the chapel the newly made Knights of the Bath watched their armour all night long. The collection of arms contains examples of weapons and armour of every age. In the church of St. Peter ad Vincula you will find the graves of the unfortunate princes, queens, and nobles who have been executed for state offences. Nothing, except the royal tombs of Westminster, so much helps to prove the reality of history as this collection of graves and slabs and tablets in this little church. And here were kept the crown jewels, about which many a chapter might be written. But to study the Tower of London one must visit it with the history of England in hand. Hither were brought all the state prisoners: here they were confined: here they were executed. Every tower, every stone, reminds one of sufferers and criminals and traitors and innocent victims. Do not, however, forget that this tower was built for the restriction of the liberties of the people. That purpose has been defeated. The liberties have grown beyond what could ever have been hoped, while the privileges of the Crown, which this tower was built to protect and to enlarge, have been restricted beyond the greatest fears of the mediæval kings. End of Lesson 17. Lesson 18. The Tower of London, Part II. Of all the prisoners who suffered death at the termination of their captivity in the Tower, there is none whose fate was so cruel as that of Lady Jane Grey. Her story belongs to English history. Recall, when you next visit the Tower, the short and tragic life of this young Queen of a 9 days' reign. She was not yet 18 when she was beheaded, not through any fault of her own, but solely because her relationship to the Crown placed her in the hands of men who used her for their own political purposes. She was the second cousin of Edward VI, Mary, and Elizabeth. Her grandmother was the sister of Henry VIII, widow of Louis XII of France, and wife of Charles, Duke of Suffolk. The young king, on his deathbed, was persuaded to name her as his successor. She was 16 years of age: she was already married to Lord Guildford Dudley, son of the Duke of Northumberland, when she was proclaimed Queen. 9 days after the proclamation she was a prisoner. On the 8th of July she was acknowledged Queen by the Lord Mayor and Aldermen. On the 10th she was taken by water from Greenwich to the Tower and proclaimed Queen in the City. On the 17th another proclamation was made of Queen Mary, and her reign was over. But the Tower she was never more to leave. On the 13th of November, after 5 months of suspense, she was tried for high treason with Cranmer, her husband, Lord Guildford, and her husband's brother, Lord Ambrose. They were all four found guilty and condemned to death, their judges being the very men who had sworn allegiance to her as Queen. It would seem that Mary had no desire to carry out the sentence. Cranmer she reserved for a more cruel death than that of beheading. He was to be burned as a heretic. The other three, 2 boys and a girl, it would be dangerous to execute on account of the popular sympathy their death would awaken. They were therefore sent back to the Tower. Probably it was intended that Lady Jane, at least, should pass the rest of her life in honourable captivity, as happened later on to Arabella Stuart. But the rebellion of Wyatt showed that her name could still be used as a cry in favour of a Protestant succession. It was therefore resolved to put both husband and wife to death. What further harm the young Lord Guilford Dudley could do is not apparent. Even then the Queen's advisers shrank from exhibiting on Tower Hill the spectacle of a young and beautiful girl, taken forth to be beheaded because certain hot-headed partisans had used her name. She was executed therefore within the verge of the Tower itself, on the so-called Green. The Green is a place where no grass will grow, it used to be said, on account of the blood that had been shed upon it. Among the sufferers here was Hastings, executed by order of King Richard, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey. A stone marks the spot on which the scaffold was set up. It was on the morning of the 12th of February that Lady Jane Grey was put to death. She was then confined in the Brick Tower, the residence of the Master of the Ordnance. From her window she saw the headless body of her husband brought back from Tower Hill in a cart. She looked upon it without shrinking. "O Guilford," she said, "the antepast is not so bitter after thou hast tasted, and which I shall soon taste, as to make my flesh tremble. It is nothing compared to the feast of which we shall partake this day in heaven." So she went forth with her 2 gentlewomen, Elizabeth Tilney and Mistress Helen, but she shed no tears. When she was on the scaffold, she spoke to the officers of the Tower and the soldiers that stood around. No man or woman, however wise and dignified, could speak more clearly and with greater dignity than this girl of 16. They had been trying to make her a Catholic. Therefore she made confession of the Protestant faith. "Good Christian people, bear witness that I die a true Christian woman, and that I do look to be saved by no other means, but only by the mercy of God in the blood of his only Son, Jesus Christ." So she made her gentlewomen bare her neck and bind her eyes, and kneeling down laid her head upon the block, and while she was saying, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit," the axe fell, and she was dead. She lies buried before the altar of St. Peter's Church, near the bodies of the Queens Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. So she died, this poor innocent child, of whom all we know is that she was so scholarly that she could read Greek in the original, that she was beautiful, of a grave and sweet disposition, and raised far above the voice of calumny. She had, says Fox, "the innocency of childhood, the beauty of youth, the gravity of age. She had the birth of a princess, the learning of a clerk, the life of a saint, and the death of a malefactor for her parents' offences." End of Lesson 18. Recording by Ruth Golding. 19 and 20 of the History of London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. The History of London by Walter Besant. Lesson 19. The Pilgrims. In the time when the road connecting village with village and town with town was but an uncertain bridle path through woods and over waste places, where in winter horse, man, and wayfarer struggled with bog and quagmire, where robbers lurked in the thickets, and fevers and agues haunted the marsh, where men went armed and every stranger was a foe, it would seem as if most men stayed where they were born and desired not to court the dangers of the unknown world. In many villages, especially in the remote places of the country, this was the case. The men of Somerset abode where they were born, speaking their own language, a race apart. The men of Norfolk abode in their county, cut off from the rest of the world by fens in the west and sea on the north and east. Their language was not understood by the men of the west or the south country. Had the other conditions of life allowed this isolation to continue undisturbed, the nation could never have been created. We should have remained a scattered collection of tribes, speaking each its own language and developing its own customs. There were three causes which stirred the stagnant waters. The first was war. The baron or feudal lord carried off the young men of the village to fight. Those of them who returned had things to tell of the outside world. They fired the imagination and awakened the enterprise of the lads. The second was trade at the trading ports. The lads saw, and continued to talk with, the foreign sailors, the Fleming, the German, the man of Rouen or Bordeaux. Some of them went on board the ships of the merchant adventurers and sailed to foreign lands. Lastly, there were the pilgrimages. From the 10th to the 15th century there was a rage for pilgrimage. Everybody wanted to become a pilgrim. No money was wanted. There would certainly be found every day some monastery at which bed and a supper would be provided for the pilgrim. It was a joyous company which fared along the road, some riding, some on foot, travelling together for safety, all bound to the same shrine where they would hear the masses and make their vows, and so return light-hearted. It was, in fact, the mediaeval way of taking a holiday. Sometimes it was to Canterbury, where was the shrine of Thomas Becket, that the pilgrims were bound; sometimes to Walsingham, where was the miraculous image of the Virgin; sometimes to Glastonbury, hallowed by the thorn miraculously flowering every year on Christmas Day, planted by Joseph of Arimathea himself. Sometimes it was farther afield, to Compostella in Spain, Rome, or even Jerusalem, that the pilgrims proposed to go. Chaucer describes such a company all starting together, riding from London to Canterbury, on pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas Becket. They are pilgrims, but there is very little piety in their discourse. One can see that, whatever the motive, whether for the expiation of sin or any other cause, the journey is full of cheerfulness and enjoyment. The Crusades were one outcome of this passion for pilgrimage. Nay, the first Crusade itself was little better than a great pilgrimage of the common people, so ignorant that they asked at the sight of every walled town if that was Jerusalem. It was a pilgrimage from which few indeed returned. In England the chief gain from pilgrimage was the bringing together of men from the different parts of the country. Remember that the men of the north could not understand the speech of the men of the south. A Norfolk rustic at the present day would hardly understand a man of Devon. There was always danger of forgetting that they all belonged to the same realm, the same nation, and the same race. But the love of pilgrimage spread so wide that it became a danger. The rustic left the plough, the blacksmith his anvil, the carpenter his bench. All left their wives and their children in order to tramp across the country on pilgrimage to some shrine. By day they marched together, at night they sat round the fire in the strangers' room of the monastery, and took their supper and slept on the reeds. A delightful change from the monotony and hard work of the village. But the bishops interposed. Let no one go on pilgrimage without his bishop's licence. Let not the monasteries give a bed and supper to any pilgrim who could not show his bishop's licence. Then the rustics and the craftsmen had to remain at home, where they have stayed, except when they went out to fight, ever since. When the pilgrim, especially the pilgrim who had been over the seas, came home, he was able to entertain his friends with stories he had seen all the rest of his life. Thus the earliest plan of the Holy Sepulchre is one drawn by a pilgrim for the instruction of certain monks who entertained him. The pilgrims were the travellers of the time. They observed foreign manners and customs. They brought home seeds and told of strange food. They extended the boundaries of the world. They prevented the native village from becoming the whole world. They taught and encouraged men to cease from regarding a stranger as an enemy. The world was thus opened out by war, trade, and pilgrimage, but most of all by pilgrimage. End of Lesson 19. Lesson 20. St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The oldest of the city hospitals is that great and splendid foundation which stands in Smithfield, the Smooth Field. It was first founded by one Rahere, of whom we know little or nothing except that he lived in the reign of Henry I, and that he founded the priory and monastery of St. Bartholomew. In the church of St. Bartholomew the Great you may see a very beautiful tomb said to be his, but the work is of a later date. It is related that while on a pilgrimage to Rome he fell ill and was like to die, and he vowed that if he were restored to health he would erect and establish a hospital for poor sick people. He did recover, and he fulfilled his vow. He built the priory of St. Bartholomew, whose church still stands in part, and beside it established his hospital. The place called Smithfield was then a swampy field used for a horse fair. It was also a place of execution without the city wall. At first the hospital was a very small place. It consisted probably of 2 large rooms or halls, one for men and one for women, with a chapel. If it had any endowment at all it must have been very small, because the master or hospitaller had to go every morning to the Shambles Newgate in order to beg meat for the maintenance of the sick. 200 years later the hospital was taken in hand by Edward IV, and provided with an establishment of master, 8 brethren, priests, and 4 sisters, who served the sick. They were all subject to the rule of St. Austin. After the death of Whittington, the hospital buildings were repaired by his bequests. On the dissolution of the religious houses, the priory and hospital of Bartholomew fell with the rest, but 5 years later the hospital was refounded and endowed by the King and the City. If you visit a hospital and are taken into a ward, you see a row of clean white beds arranged in orderly position on either side of the long room. The temperature is regulated, the ventilation is perfect, there are means by which the patient can be examined in private, the diseases are apportioned to separate wards, everything is managed with the greatest cleanliness and order. If an operation is performed, the patient is kept under chloroform and feels nothing. The physicians are men of the highest scientific reputation, the nurses are trained assistants, the food is the best that can be procured. The poorest man brought to the hospital is treated with the same care, the same science, the same luxuries as the richest. Look, however, at the hospital as founded by Rahere. There is a great hall with a chapel at one end, at which mass is daily sung. The room is narrow and lofty, lit by Norman windows, 2 or 3 on a side. There is a lantern in the roof. Under the lantern a fire is burning every day, the smoke rising to the roof. The hall is dark and ill ventilated, the air foul and heavy with the breath of 60 or 70 sick men, lying in beds arranged in rows along the wall. There are not separate beds for each patient, but as the sick are brought in, they are laid together side by side in the same bed, whatever the disease, so that he who suffers from fever is placed beside another who suffers from palsy. There are 4 in a bed, and in times of pressure even more. Sometimes one arrives who develops the plague, when the whole of the patients in the hospital catch the infection and all die together. The surgeons are especially skilled in the dressing of wounds received in battle or in fray. The sisters can tie up a broken limb and stop a bleeding wound. The brethren go about the beds administering the last offices of the church to the dying. The food is scanty, the appliances are rude, there is small hope of recovery. Yet to die in hospital, tended and consoled, instead of in the hut where life has been passed, is something for which to be grateful. Consider into how great, how noble a foundation the little hospital of Rahere has grown. The modern hospital contains 676 beds. It receives about 150,000 patients every year, of whom 7,000 are inpatients, 18,000 outpatients, and 130,000 casuals. The 8 brethren have become 30 physicians and surgeons, besides the assistants called clinical clerks and dressers. The 4 sisters are now 159 sisters and nurses. There is a noble school of medicine, there are museums, libraries, lecture rooms, and there is a residential college for medical students. There is a convalescent hospital in the country. No hospital in the world has a larger or a more noble record than this of St. Bartholomew. And it all sprang from the resolution of one man, who started a humble house for the reception of the sick in a poor and despised place outside the city wall, but near to the shambles, where one could beg for broken victuals and for the pieces of meat that the butchers could not sell. Thus, out of one good deed, apparently of small importance, has grown a never-ending stream of refreshment and healing. It has lasted for 700 years already. There seems no reason why it should ever stop. End of Lesson 20. Recording by Ruth Golding. And 22 of the History of London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. The History of London by Walter Besant. Lesson 21. The Terror of Leprosy. 1 mile outside the city walls, on the west, stood for 400 years the Hospital of St. Giles in the Fields. Here was a lazar house, i.e. a hospital for lepers. It was founded by Maud, Queen of Henry I. It was dedicated to St. Giles because this saint was considered the protector of cripples. Hence the name Cripplegate, which really means the Little Gate, was applied to the church of St. Giles and supposed to mean the gate near the church dedicated to the patron saint of cripples. A common result of leprosy was to make the sufferer lame and crippled, hence the connection. Generally, however, Lazarus, whom our Lord raised from the dead, was esteemed the saint of lepers, whence a lepers' hospital was always called a lazar house. In the Middle Ages, the mysterious disease called leprosy was an ever-present terror. Other plagues appeared at intervals and disappeared. Leprosy remained. It never left the land. It struck the king on his throne, the bishop in his cathedral, the abbess in her nunnery, the soldier in camp, the merchant in his counting-house, the sailor at sea. No class could escape it. Robert Bruce died of it. Orival, Bishop of London, died of it. Baldwin, King of Jerusalem, died of it. To this day it prevails in India, at the Cape, in the Pacific Islands, while there are occasional cases found in our own hospitals. The disease was incurable. The man, woman, or child attacked by it would surely and slowly die of it. The leper was unclean, he was thrust out of the town, he had to live apart, or congregated in hospitals with other wretches similarly afflicted. If he walked abroad, he wore a grey gown for distinction, and carried a clapper as he went along, crying, "Unclean, unclean," so that the people might stand aside and not so much as touch his garments. And since he could not work with his hands, he was permitted to carry into the market a clap dish, that is to say, a bowl or basin in which to receive food and alms. Footnote: La Croix, Science, page 146. End of footnote. Leprosy is supposed to have had its origin in Egypt. The laws laid down in the book of Leviticus for the separation of lepers are stringent and precise. It was believed, partly no doubt on account of these statutes in the book of the Jewish law, that the disease was brought into Western Europe by the Crusaders, but this was erroneous, because it was in this country before the Crusaders. Thus the Palace of St. James stands upon the site of a lazar house founded before the Conquest for 14 leprous maidens. This is not the place to describe the symptoms and the results of this dreadful disease. Suffice it to say that the skin thickens, is discoloured and ulcerates, that the limbs swell, that the fingers and toes drop off, that the voice sinks to a whisper, and that the sufferer's mind is weakened by his malady. The fearful scourge was so prevalent that there was not a town, hardly a village, in any country of Europe, which had not in those centuries its lepers and its lazar house, great or small. Every effort was made to isolate them. They were not allowed to worship with the rest of the people. They were provided with a separate building or chapel, where, through a hole in the wall, they could look on at the performance of Mass. And in addition, as you have seen, they lived apart and took their food apart. As for their houses, the lazar houses, the chief of them all, the place where Abbot possessed some kind of authority over the others, was one built in a village near Melton Mowbray, called Burton Lazars. The Hospital of St. Giles, for instance, became shortly after its foundation a cell or dependency of this house. Whatever the cause of this malady, whether it be contagious, i.e. communicated by touch, or infectious, that is, communicated by breathing the same air, or hereditary, it is quite certain that it was greatly aggravated by the habits of the time. Bad food, uncleanly habits, bad air, all contributed to the spread of leprosy. Especially it has been considered that the long fasts, during which meat was prohibited, encouraged the disease, not because abstinence from meat is in itself a bad thing, but because the people had to eat fish imperfectly cured or kept too long, and unwholesome. Freshwater fish could not be procured in sufficient quantities, and it was impossible to convey fish from the sea more than a certain distance inland. The dreadful appearance of the lepers, their horrible sufferings, produced loathing more than pity. People were horror-stricken at the sight of them. They drove them out of their sight, they punished them cruelly if they broke the rules of separation. They imprisoned any citizen who should harbour a leper. They kept bailiffs at the city gates to keep them from entering. 14 of these afflicted persons were required to be maintained in accordance with Queen Maud's foundation by the Hospital of St. Giles. There was also a lazar house in the Old Kent Road, Southwark, one between Mile End and Bow, one at Kingsland between Shoreditch and Stoke Newington, one at Knightsbridge west of Charing Cross, and one at Holloway. On the dissolution of the monasteries, all these lazar houses were suppressed. Now, since we hear very little more about lepers, and since no new lazar houses were built, and since the prohibitions to enter churches, towns, etc., are no more renewed, it is tolerably certain that leprosy by the middle of the 16th century had practically disappeared. The above will show, however, how great and terrible a thing it was between the 9th and the 16th centuries. End of Lesson 21. Lesson 22. The Terror of Famine. Suppose that all the ocean traffic was stopped, that there was no communication or exchange of commodities between our country and another. Suppose that the people of this island depended entirely on their own harvests and their own cattle for their support. You would then easily understand how a single bad year might produce scarcity of food, and a very bad year might produce a famine. That was our condition down to the 15th century. Some corn may have been brought over from Prussia or from Hamburg, but there was no regular supply. The country depended on its own harvests. Therefore the fear of a famine or of scarcity was ever present to the people. Many of these famines are on record. In the year 990 a famine raged over the whole of England. In 1126 there was a terrible scarcity. Wheat was sold at 6 shillings a horse load. Now in the 12th century a shilling meant more than £1 of our money in purchasing power. It is not stated how much constituted a horse load. It would probably mean the filling of the 2 baskets hanging on either side of the pack horse. In 1257, after a wet season and a bad harvest, wheat rose to 24 shillings a quarter, a price which prohibited all but the richest from eating wheaten bread. It is said that 20,000 perished of starvation. In 1316, after the same cause, wheat became so scarce that its price rose to £4 a quarter. So great was the distress this year that great nobles had to dismiss their retainers. The roads in the country were crowded with robbers. Robberies were openly committed in the streets for the sake of food. In the prisons, the unfortunate criminals, left to starve, murdered and devoured each other. The people ate carrion and dead dogs. In 1335 there was another time of scarcity and suffering. In 1439 the distress was so great that the people made bread of fern roots and ivy berries. Then, for the first time, we read of the famine being assuaged by the arrival of rye from Prussia. In 1527 a threatened famine was checked by the Hanseatic merchants, who gave or sold 100 quarters of wheat to the city, and sent 3 ships to Danzig for more. In 1593 and in 1597 wheat rose to an enormous price. The last time of scarcity was during the long war with France, which lasted from 1792 to 1815, nearly a quarter of a century. We were then compelled to depend almost entirely upon our own harvests. Wheat went up as high as 103 shillings a quarter. At no time did the poorer classes depend much upon wheat. Rye and oats made the bread of the working people, but bad harvests affected rye and oats as much as wheat. The famine prices of wheat may be explained by the following facts. In the reign of Henry I, at ordinary prices, bread enough for 1 meal for 100 men could be bought for a shilling, and a whole sheep cost 4d. In the next century, when wheat was at 6 shillings a quarter, a farthing loaf was to weigh 24 ounces wholemeal and 16 ounces white. When it was at 1 6d. a quarter, the farthing loaf was to weigh 96 ounces whole grain and 64 ounces white. The quartern loaf of £4, or 64 ounces, now costs 5d., wheat being very cheap. So that prices in time of plenty being supposed the same, money was worth 20 times in that century as much as it is worth now. In the reign of Edward I. wheat went down to 1s. a quarter. The food of the craftsmen in London was, in ordinary times, plentiful and cheap. The City, as we have seen, was always remarkable for the great abundance of provision which was brought there. And there is every reason to believe that while the rustic fared poorly and was underfed, the craftsmen of the towns always enjoyed good food and enough of it. This made a time of scarcity hard to bear for one who habitually lived well. Once or twice an attempt was made to provide the City with granaries in case of famine. Thus the origin of Leadenhall, the great City market, was the erecting of a public granary here by Sir Simon Eyre in 1419. Attached to the hall, after the manner of the time, was a chapel dedicated to the Holy Trinity, which the founder endowed for 60 priests, who were to prepare service every day for those who frequented the market. Another public granary was established in 1610 at Bridewell Palace. This was built to contain 6,000 quarters of wheat. Nothing more is heard about these public granaries. Probably the public mind grew more assured on the subject of famine as it became better understood that the loss of one country might be made up from the superfluous harvests of another. The lesson taught by the Hanseatic merchants in sending to Prussia for corn was not likely to be lost. At the present moment, with means of transport always in readiness and the electric wire joining the most distant countries, it might seem that famine was a thing no longer to be feared. There cannot be bad harvests all over the world. Not only can we every year import so much wheat that we need grow little in this country, but we import frozen meat in vast quantities. We bring fruit of all kinds from the most distant countries, insomuch that there are some fruits, such as apples, oranges, grapes, bananas, which we can enjoy the whole year round. But famine may yet play a great and a disastrous part in our history. We must not forget that we enjoy our present abundance of all things on one of two conditions. First, that we are strong enough to protect the waterway and keep it open, or secondly, that we remain at peace. The latter we cannot hope to do always. Therefore it is of vital importance that we maintain a strong fleet, well equipped, ready to fight at all times and at the shortest notice, superior to any likely combination that may be brought against us. Therefore, again, it behoves every man in these isles to be jealous of the fleet, for a time may come when the way of the ocean may be closed, and when Great Britain, through the neglect of her rulers, may be starved into a shameful and ruinous surrender. End of Lesson 22. Recording by Ruth Golding. 23 to 25 of the History of London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. The History of London by Walter Besant. Lesson 23. St. Paul's Cathedral, Part 1. When London was converted to Christianity in the year 610, the first Bishop of London, Mellitus, built a church on the highest ground within the walls of the city. This church he dedicated to St. Paul the Apostle, who first preached to the Gentiles. What kind of church this was, whether great or small, whether of wood or of stone, how often rebuilt or repaired, we know not. Probably it was quite a small church at first. This church or its successor was taken down in the year 1087, when Bishop Maurice began to build a new and far more stately cathedral. 50 years later, most of the church, not yet completed, was burned down. Its building, thus delayed, was continued for nearly 2 centuries. The steeple was not completed, for instance, till 150 years after the commencement of the building. The drawing shows the church as it was in the 14th and 15th centuries. Old St. Paul's was one of the largest churches in Europe. Its length was at least 600 feet, the spire reached the height of 460 feet. The church stood in a large walled enclosure, still kept partly open, though the wall has long since been pulled down, and there have been encroachments on the north side. The church in the 14th century was not regarded only as a place for public worship. Masses and services of all kinds were going on all day long. The place was bright, not only with the sunlight streaming through the painted glass, but with wax tapers burning before many a shrine, at some all day and all night. People came to the church to walk about, for rest, for conversation, for the transaction of business, to make or receive payments, to hire servants. The middle aisle of the church, where all this was done, was called Paul's Walk, or Duke Humphrey's Walk. Here were tables where 12 licensed scribes sat writing letters for those who wanted their services. They would also prepare a lease, a deed, a conveyance, any legal document. The church was filled with tombs and monuments, some of these very ancient, some of the greatest interest. Here was one called the tomb of Duke Humphrey, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who was really buried at St. Albans. On May Day the watermen used to come to St. Paul's in order to sprinkle water and strew herbs upon this tomb, I know not why. Those who were out of work and went dinnerless were said to dine with Duke Humphrey, and there was a proverb, "Trash and trumpery is the way to Duke Humphrey," trumpery being used in its original meaning, tromperie, deceit. Among other tombs there were those of the Saxon kings, Sebbi and Ethelred. The first of these was king of the East Saxons: he was converted by Bishop Erkenwald. The second was the elder brother of King Alfred. There were tombs or shrines to many saints now forgotten: that of St. Erkenwald, whose fame rivalled that of Edward the Confessor at Westminster, St. Cuthbert at Durham, and St. Thomas à Becket at Canterbury; that of St. Ethelbert; that of St. Roger, Bishop of London: a cope which St. Roger wore is still preserved in the sacristy; and that of St. Wilfrid. At every one of these shrines miracles were wrought, or believed to be wrought. There was also a miraculous crucifix, said to have been discovered by Lucius, the first Christian king of ancient Britain in the year 140. Great gifts were constantly made to this crucifix. Under the cathedral, in the crypt, was a parish church, that of St. Faith's. It is now united with the parish church of St. Augustine's in Watling Street. Outside the church, almost against the south wall, was the parish church of St. Gregory. In the same way the parish church of St. Margaret stands outside Westminster Abbey. Within we can see, in imagination, the people walking about. They have not yet begun to stand bareheaded in church: some dictating to the scribes, some leaning against the tombs, some sitting on the bases of the great round pillars. There were no pews, benches, or chairs in the cathedral. The chantry priests are saying masses in the chapels. The people are kneeling before the golden shrine of St. Erkenwald, resplendent with lights, jewels, gold and silver. Women lay their offerings before the miraculous crucifix, praying for the restoration to health of son or husband. A wedding is celebrated in one chapel: a funeral mass is being said in another. Servants gather about a certain pillar, waiting to be hired. Porters, carrying baskets on their heads, enter at the north door and tramp through, going out of the south. Processions of priests and choir pass up and down the aisles. The organ peals and echoes along the long and lofty roof. See, here comes a troop of men. They carry instruments of music, they are dressed in a livery, a cloak of green. They march together, entering at the western doors and tramping through the whole length of the church to the chapel of Our Lady in the east. This is the Guild of the Minstrels. There were many other guilds attached to the cathedral. You shall learn presently what was the meaning of these guilds. End of Lesson 23. Lesson 24. St. Paul's Cathedral, Part II. Such was Paul's in the 15th century. In the 16th the Reformation came. The candles were all put out. The shrines were destroyed. The altars were taken out of the chapels. The miraculous images were taken away. The church, compared with its previous condition, became a shell. The choir was walled off for public worship. The rest of the church became a place of public resort. The poets of the time are full of allusions to Paul's Walk. It was a common thoroughfare even for men leading pack horses and asses. The cathedral, left to neglect, began to fall into a ruinous condition. An attempt was made at restoration. Funds were collected, but they came in slowly. Laud, who became Bishop of London in 1631, gave an impetus to the work. The celebrated Inigo Jones was appointed architect. In order to prevent the church from being turned into an exchange, he built a west porch, which is shown in some of the pictures of St. Paul's. In the time of the Commonwealth this portico was let off in shops and stalls. The nave of the church actually became a cavalry barrack. When King Charles returned, it was resolved to repair and restore the cathedral, by this time almost in ruins. But while the citizens were considering what should be done, the Great Fire of London settled the question by burning down all that was left. Then Christopher Wren began the present building. The first stone was laid on June 21st, 1675, 9 years after the fire. Divine service was performed on December 2nd, 1697, the day of thanksgiving for the Peace of Ryswyck. The work was completed in 1710, 35 years after its commencement. The present church is 100 feet shorter than its predecessor. Its dome is also 100 feet lower than the former spire. The grandeur of the building cannot be appreciated by any near view, because the houses block it in on all sides, and the former view from the bottom of Ludgate Hill is now spoiled by the railway bridge. Those who wish to see what St. Paul's really is, how splendid a church it is, how grandly it stands above the whole city, must cross the river and look at it from Bankside, Southwark. The dome is threefold. It consists of an outer casing of wood covered with lead, a cone of bricks which supports the lantern and cross, and an inner cupola of brick which supports nothing. The towers at the west end are 222 feet in height. St. Paul's, especially since the crowding at Westminster Abbey, is becoming the national burial church. It is already well filled with monuments of British worthies and heroes of this and the last century. Of men distinguished in literature, art, and science, there are buried here Dr. Johnson, Hallam the historian, Sir Joshua Reynolds the painter, Turner the painter, Rennie the engineer who built Waterloo Bridge, Sir William Jones the great Oriental scholar, and Sir Astley Cooper the great surgeon. There is also buried here, as he should be, Sir Christopher Wren himself. But those who visit the cathedral desire most to see the tombs of Wellington and Nelson. The remains of the former lie in a great sarcophagus worked out of a single piece of Cornish porphyry. Those of the Admiral were placed first in a coffin made from the mainmast of the French ship Orient, taken at the Battle of the Nile. This was deposited in a sarcophagus made by Cardinal Wolsey, and intended for the burial of King Henry VIII. In the cathedral, too, you will find the monuments of those splendid fighting men, Lord Collingwood, Nelson's friend, Howe and Rodney, Earl St. Vincent, who won the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, Lord Duncan of Camperdown, and many others. In the crypt you will find, if you look for it, the brass tablet which marks the spot where lie the remains of a man whose history should be an encouragement to every boy who reads this book. His name was Edward Palmer. Born without family influence, plainly educated at the grammar school of his town, he taught himself in the teeth of all difficulties, that of bad health especially, Arabic, Persian, and all the languages which belong to that group. At the age of 24 he was so splendid an Oriental scholar that the greatest Orientalist at Cambridge declared that he could teach him nothing. He was elected to a fellowship at St. John's College, and became the Lord Almoner's Professor of Arabic. He mastered, in addition to his Oriental studies, all the European languages except Russian and the Slavonic group. He explored the desert of the Exodus and the peninsula of Sinai. He did a great deal of literary work. But he was not buried in St. Paul's Cathedral for these studies. In the year 1882, when the Egyptian war broke out, he was sent on a secret mission to the tribes of the desert. He knew them all. He could talk their language as well as his own. He was the equal of any one in his knowledge of Arabic poetry and his power of telling stories. They welcomed him with open arms. The service that he rendered to his country, for which he was honoured with a funeral at St. Paul's, was that he prevented these tribes from destroying the Suez Canal. He succeeded in reaching the British camp at Suez in safety, his task accomplished, the safety of the canal assured. He was murdered in return by a party of Egyptian Arabs sent from Cairo. His bones were recovered by Sir Charles Warren, who further tracked down and hanged every man connected with the murder. The road to possible greatness lies open to all, but the way leads through a difficult and thorny way, only to be passed, as Palmer found, by resolution invincible and by long, patient industry. End of Lesson 24. Lesson 25. Paul's Churchyard. St. Paul's Cathedral stood in the centre of an oval-shaped enclosure, very much like the present St. Paul's Churchyard, save that the houses now in the north are an encroachment. This open space was surrounded by a wall, in which were 6 gates embattled. The first was the Great Western Gate facing Ludgate Hill, the second in Paul's Alley in Paternoster Row, the third at Cannon Alley, the fourth, or Little Gate, where is now the entrance into Cheapside, the fifth, St. Augustine's Gate, Watling Street, the sixth at Paul's Chain. Walking round this enclosure we come first upon the Bishop's Palace, standing on the north side of the nave. The palace was provided with a private entrance into the cathedral. Beyond the palace was a very beautiful cloister called Pardon Church Hall. In this cloister stood a chapel built by Gilbert, father of Thomas à Becket. Many monuments and tombs of great persons stood within this cloister, which was also remarkable for its Dances of Death. This was a series of paintings representing Death as a skeleton armed with a dart, leading by the hand men and women of every degree, from the highest to the lowest. There were formerly many examples of such dances. Next to the cloister was the library, the catalogue of which still exists to show what a scholar's collection of books then meant. Next to the library stood the College of the Minor Canons. Then came Charnel Chapel, beneath which was a crypt filled with human bones taken from the churchyard. Remember that this has been a burial place ever since the year 610, when a church was first built here. From the year 610 till the year 1840, or for a period of 1200 years, new graves were continually made in this ground. Who can guess how many thousands lie buried here? Every handful of the dust is a handful of human remains. From time to time, however, the bones were collected and placed in this crypt of Charnel Chapel. The chapel itself was apparently a large building, for when it was pulled down the materials were used by the Duke of Somerset at the Reformation in building Somerset House in the Strand. There are yet standing some portions of the original house, so that the stones of Charnel Chapel may still be seen. As for the crypt, they carried away the bones, which made 1,000 cartloads, and laid them over Finsbury Fields, covering them with ground, on which were erected 3 windmills. The site is marked by the street called Windmill Street. Next to Charnel Chapel stood the famous Paul's Cross. This famous place was a pulpit cross from which sermons might be preached in the open air. Several London churches had their open-air pulpits, notably St. Michael's, Cornhill, St. Mary's Spital without Bishopsgate. At this cross a sermon was preached every Easter to the Lord Mayor and Aldermen. When Paul's Cross was erected is not known. It probably stood on the site of some scaffold or steps from which the people were anciently harangued, for this was the place of the folk mote, or meeting of the people. Here were read aloud and proclaimed the King's laws and orders. Here the people were informed of war and peace. Here papal bulls were read. There was a cross standing here in the year 1256. Very likely it was already ancient. In the year 1387 it was ruinous and had to be repaired. It was again repaired or rebuilt in 1480. Paul's Cross played a very important part in the Reformation. Here the Rood of Bexley, which was a crucifix where the eyes and lips were made to move, and the people were taught that it was miraculous, was exposed and broken to pieces. Here the famous images of Walsingham and Ipswich, the object of so many pilgrimages, were brought to be broken to pieces before the eyes of the people. Here Latimer preached, a man of the people who could speak to them in a way to make them understand. Had it not been for the preaching of Latimer and others like him in plain language, the Reformation would have been an attempt, and probably a failure, to enforce upon the people the opinions of certain scholars. Paul's Cross did not perish in the fire. It was taken down in the year 1643 or thereabouts in order to be rebuilt, but this was not done, and when the fire destroyed the cathedral, Paul's Cross was forgotten. Its site may be seen in the churchyard at the north-east corner of the choir, marked by a flat stone, but it must be remembered that the old church was wider, but farther south. On the south side of Paul's Churchyard we pass in succession the beautiful chapter house, the church of St. Gregory, and the deanery. Close to the western gate are residences for the canons. South of the enclosure are the cathedral brewhouse and bakehouse. Such are some of the buildings in Paul's Churchyard. The cathedral establishment supported a great army of priests and people. For many of them, perhaps for most, there were residences of some kind either within the enclosure or close beside it. Thus the priests, including bishop, dean, archdeacons, and canons, 130 in number. Then there were the inferior officers, yet persons of consideration and authority, such as sacrist, almoner, bookbinder, chief brewer, chief baker, with all their servants; scribes, messengers, bookbinders, illuminators and copyists, singing men and choir boys, and women to keep the church clean. When we add that the brewer had to provide 200 gallons of beer a day, it is obvious that there must have been a good many people belonging to the cathedral who lived in the enclosure called the churchyard. End of Lesson 25. Recording by Ruth Golding.